What if everything you thought you knew about history's greatest rulers was missing half the story? For centuries, the narrative of power in the ancient world has been dominated by kings, conquerors, and male leaders, while the extraordinary women who shaped empires, led armies, and ruled with unmatched brilliance were pushed to the shadows. But behind every great civilization, there were queens, pharaohs, and warrior women whose legacies were systematically erased, rewritten, or simply ignored. Today, we're setting the record straight. Picture this: a world where a woman commands an army to victory, outmaneuvering rival kingdoms with strategies so bold they're still studied today. Or a ruler who transforms her society's laws, art, and trade, only to have her name chiseled off monuments by those who couldn't bear to share credit. These aren't exceptions, they're the untold rule. From the deserts of Egypt to the bustling cities of Mesopotamia, ancient female rulers wielded power with a fierceness and finesse that shattered expectations. Yet their stories were buried under layers of bias, their achievements attributed to husbands, brothers, or sheer luck. This isn't just about uncovering forgotten names, it's about rewriting history itself. Imagine the courage it took for these women to claim thrones in societies that saw their ambition as a threat. Think of the sheer force of will required to govern when every decision was scrutinized twice as harshly, every triumph questioned, and every setback amplified. Their lives were acts of rebellion, their reigns proof that greatness has no gender, and now, for the first time, we're piecing together their lost legacies. Over the course of this journey, you'll meet 25 of history's most astonishing female leaders, women who ruled empires, outsmarted their enemies, and left marks so profound, even time couldn't erase them completely. So let's step into the shadows of history and bring their stories back into the light, because the past looks far more fascinating when we finally see it whole. Hatshepsut didn't just break the mold, she shattered it with the force of 1,000 chariots. In a land where gods and kings were male by default, she ascended Egypt's throne not as a regent or consort, but as a full-fledged pharaoh, donning the false beard and regalia reserved for kings. Her reign, stretching over 2 decades in the 15th century B.C.E., wasn't just successful, it was a golden age of art, trade, and architectural marvels. Yet today, her temples stand scarred, her statues vandalized, her name nearly wiped from history. So how did a woman come to wield such unchecked power in a society built around divine masculinity? The answer lies in sheer political genius. When her husband, Thutmose II, died unexpectedly, their infant son was too young to rule. As stepmother, Hatshepsut could have settled for the traditional role of regent, but she had grander ambitions. Within 7 years, she staged what might be history's first rebranding campaign, commissioning art and inscriptions that reframed her not as a placeholder, but as the divine heir chosen by the god Ammon himself. Portrayals show her with a muscular male physique, the ceremonial beard, even the striped Neme's headcloth, visual propaganda asserting her right to rule as equals with the great pharaohs before her. And rule she did. While later chroniclers painted her as a schemer, the evidence tells a different story. Her reign was marked by prosperity, not conquest. She launched ambitious trading expeditions to the mysterious land of Punt, bringing back gold, ivory, and exotic incense that filled Egypt's coffers. At Deir el-Bahari, she built a mortuary temple so breathtaking it seems to merge with the cliffs behind it, a testament to both her devotion to the gods and her understanding of power as spectacle. Even her coronation wasn't just ceremony, it was a masterclass in political theater, with priests and nobles enacting her divine selection before the public. But greatness invites envy. After her death, her stepson Thutmose III, the once infant king she'd sidelined, ordered her name chiseled off monuments, her statues toppled, her legacy systematically erased. For centuries, historians assumed it was personal revenge. Yet recent discoveries hint at something darker, a calculated effort to restore Maat, the cosmic order Egyptians believed required male rulers. Even her death remains shrouded in mystery. Was it natural causes, poison, a quiet coup? The truth may lie in her mummy, identified only in 2007 after a decade of forensic detective work, a woman in her 50s with a bad tooth and a broken legacy. Hatshepsut's story isn't just about one woman's brilliance, it's a window into how history gets written and rewritten. Her successors didn't just attack her memory, they proved how threatening a successful female ruler could be to the status quo. Yet try as they might, they couldn't erase her completely. The very chisel marks meant to destroy her name now highlight its absence, shouting her presence across millennia. In the end, the stone itself became her loudest witness. The destruction of Hatshepsut's legacy wasn't hasty vandalism, it was a meticulous campaign, stone by stone, hieroglyph by hieroglyph, as if erasing her from history could rewrite reality itself. Thutmose III's artisans didn't just smash statues, they targeted the very essence of her power. The Assyrian statues at Deir el-Bahari, which once showed her as a divine ruler, were reduced to rubble. Inscriptions proclaiming her achievements were carefully chiseled away, her name replaced with those of her male predecessors or left as ghostly blanks. Even the grand obelisk she commissioned at Karnak praising Ammon for his daughter, the king, were walled up, hidden behind layers of stone as if her voice could be bricked away forever. But why such fervent destruction? Early scholars assumed personal vengeance, a stepson seething after years of playing second fiddle. Yet the scale suggests something far deeper. Thutmose didn't just attack Hatshepsut, he erased the precedent she set. In a society where Maat divine order demanded male rulership, her success was a dangerous aberration. By methodically purging her monuments, he wasn't just rewriting her story, he was reinforcing the dogma that women shouldn't rule. Ironically, his own records revealed the truth. During their co-rule, Egypt thrived. His later military campaigns, often hailed as his greatest feats, were bankrolled by the wealth Hatshepsut's trade expeditions amassed. Modern archaeology has turned this erasure into a detective story. When Howard Carter unearthed her sarcophagus in 1920, it was empty, a royal tomb stripped even in death. For decades, her mummy was mislabeled as a minor noblewoman, tucked away in a dusty corner of Cairo's museum. Then in 2007, a single tooth changed everything. Scanned from a canopic box inscribed with her name, it perfectly matched a gap in the mouth of an unidentified female mummy, one posed with arms crossed in royal burial fashion. DNA confirmed her relation to the Thutmoside line, and fractures on her jaw hinted at possible foul play. Even in death, she refused to disappear. The most haunting evidence, though, lies in the chisel marks themselves. At her temple, where artisans once carved her divine birth myth showing the god Ammon fashioning her as his heir, the cuts are shallow. They didn't obliterate the scenes, they skinned away her titles, leaving the outlines intact. Like shadows after a fire, these gaps now scream louder than the original carvings. Even the reuse of her statues as filler in construction sites backfired. Buried in rubble, they survived far better than those left exposed. Today, digital reconstructions stitch together fragments, projecting her image onto gutted walls, forcing history to see what was stolen, perhaps the greatest irony. Thutmose's erasure preserved her more perfectly than praise ever could. By trying so hard to make her vanish, he turned her into a puzzle archaeologists couldn't resist solving. Every scrape of his chisel became a breadcrumb, leading us back to the woman who dared rule as king. Now, when visitors stand in her temple, they don't just see a ruined shrine, they witness the stubborn persistence of memory and the quiet triumph of a queen who outlasted even stone. While Hatshepsut rewrote the rules of power in Egypt, across the world in 7th century China, another woman was carving her path to the throne with even sharper edges. Wu Zetian didn't just challenge the system, she dismantled it, climbing from the lowest rungs of the imperial harem to become the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. But her rise wasn't just a story of ambition, it was a masterclass in survival, where every move was calculated, every rival outmaneuvered, and every setback turned into an opportunity. Born into a minor noble family, Wu entered Emperor Taizong's court as a concubine at just 14, a mere ornament in a system designed to silence women. Yet even then, she stood apart. Legend says Taizong nicknamed her Mei Nyang, the glamorous one, but it wasn't beauty that secured her future. When Taizong died, custom demanded concubines shave their heads and enter a nunnery, a life of quiet oblivion. Wu, however, caught the eye of his son, Emperor Gaozong. By the time she returned to the palace, she wasn't just another consort. She was a strategist, fluent in literature, politics, and the art of whispering in the right ears. What followed was a chess game played with human lives. The emperor's wife, Empress Wang, saw Wu as harmless until Wu's newborn daughter mysteriously died, and she pointed fingers at Wang. Historians still debate whether Wu smothered her own child to frame her rival, but the outcome was undeniable. Wang was exiled, then executed, and Wu took her place as empress. When Gaozong suffered strokes, Wu seized control of the bureaucracy, promoting scholars loyal to her while sidelining aristocratic families who opposed her. By the time Gaozong died, she'd already been pulling the strings for years, but stepping into the light as emperor required more than just influence. In 690, Wu did the unthinkable. She founded her own dynasty, the Zhou, declaring herself sacred and divine emperor. To justify her rule, she turned to Buddhism, commissioning texts that portrayed her as the reincarnation of a future Buddha, destined to bring a golden age. She expanded the civil service exams, empowering commoners over the old nobility, and patronized arts and education, leaving a cultural legacy that outlasted her reign. Yet for all her reforms, history remembers her differently, thanks to the Confucian scholars who later vilified her. They called her a poisoner, a seductress, a tyrant who murdered her own family. Tales spread of her torture chambers, her executed rivals, even her alleged drowning of entire political factions in a vat of wine. But modern historians note a glaring double standard. Male emperors who did far worse are celebrated as strong leaders, while Wu's ruthlessness became proof of unnatural ambition. The truth lies somewhere in between. Yes, she eliminated threats with brutal efficiency, but in a court where defeat meant death, her choices were often kill or be killed. Wu's final act was perhaps her most revealing. At 80, facing rebellion and forced to abdicate, she didn't cling to power. She peacefully restored the Tang dynasty, dying soon after, but not before ordering her tombstone left blank. No list of achievements, no defenses against her critics, just a silent slab daring history to judge her on its own terms. Centuries later, we're still trying. Wu Zetian's reign wasn't just about political survival, it was a cultural earthquake that reshaped China's very foundations. While later historians fixated on rumors of her ruthlessness, they often overlooked her most radical act, dismantling the aristocracy's stranglehold on power. For centuries, high offices went to the sons of noble families by birthright, leaving talent festering in the lower ranks. Wu turned that system on its head. She expanded the imperial examinations, demanding that even candidates from powerful families prove their worth through grueling tests on Confucian classics, poetry, and policy debates. Overnight, scholarly merit rivaled bloodline as the path to influence, and commoners previously locked out of governance suddenly had a shot at changing their destinies. But Wu didn't stop there. She actively sought out brilliant minds overlooked by the old guard, personally interviewing candidates and promoting those who showed promise. One famous edict ordered local officials to recommend unorthodox talents, thinkers with bold ideas that challenged tradition. This wasn't just fairness, it was strategy. By flooding the bureaucracy with scholars loyal to her rather than to aristocratic clans, she weakened the factions plotting against her. The ripple effects were staggering. For the first time, a farmer's son could rise to advise the emperor, while a duke's heir might find himself outranked by a poet from the provinces. Though Confucian traditionalists later tried to roll back these reforms, the genie was out of the bottle. Wu's system became the blueprint for China's meritocracy for over 1,000 years. Her cultural revolution extended far beyond politics. While male chroniclers painted her as a schemer, the art flourishing under her rule tells a different story. Wu poured state resources into Buddhist projects, commissioning colossal statues like the 17-meter-tall Vairocana Buddha at Longmen Grottoes, its face allegedly modeled after her own. She sponsored translations of sacred texts, built monasteries, and even reinterpreted Buddhist doctrine to position herself as a compassionate bodhisattva ruler. Yet her patronage wasn't purely propaganda. Poetry flourished under her reign, with courtiers composing verses comparing her to legendary sage kings. She established cultural academies where women studied alongside men, a radical notion at the time. The sheer volume of art, literature, and architecture surviving from her era contradicts the later smear campaigns claiming her reign was a dark age. The paradox of Wu lies in the stark contrast between her demonization and her governance. Tax records show her reign brought stability and prosperity, with land reforms redistributing acreage to peasants and granaries stocked to weather famines. She streamlined the legal system, punishing corrupt officials while reducing excessive penalties for minor crimes. Even her much maligned secret police, often cited as proof of tyranny, were no more brutal than those of male emperors praised as strong leaders. The difference: when a woman wielded power decisively, it was framed as monstrous. Perhaps the most telling evidence of her effectiveness lies in her enemies' actions. After forcing her abdication, her successors didn't undo her policies. They kept the examination system, the legal reforms, even the Buddhist infrastructure. They simply erased her name from the achievements, grafting them onto male rulers' legacies. That selective memory speaks volumes. What terrified them wasn't that Wu ruled badly, but that she ruled too well, proving a woman could excel at the ultimate man's job. Centuries later, the contradictions remain unresolved. Was she a tyrant who manipulated her way to power, or a visionary who broke barriers others dared not touch? The answer, like the woman herself, refuses to fit neatly into history's boxes. Amanirenas wasn't the kind of queen who ruled from a gilded throne. She rode into battle, spear in hand, with the desert wind whipping at her back. In 25 BCE, when Rome's legions marched south into Kush demanding tribute and land, they expected to bully a fractured kingdom into submission. Instead, they collided with a warrior queen who'd spent years uniting tribal chiefs under a single banner, forging an army that fought not for gold but for survival. What followed was one of antiquity's most astonishing uprisings, a guerrilla war led by a one-eyed monarch who refused to kneel. The conflict erupted when Roman governor Petronius invaded Kush, sacking the royal city of Napata and enslaving thousands. Most conquered rulers would have sued for peace. Amanirenas did the opposite. She launched a lightning campaign northward, capturing Roman forts, burning settlements, and even toppling statues of Emperor Augustus, a deliberate insult to Rome's pride. The most famous moment came during a brutal skirmish near Phila, where Amanirenas lost her right eye to a Roman arrow. Legend says she yanked it out herself, then charged back into the fray, turning injury into inspiration for her troops. Whether the tale is literal or symbolic, the message was clear. This queen would rather bleed than retreat. For 3 years, Kush's forces harassed Rome's legions across 500 miles of desert, using scorched earth tactics and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Roman accounts dismiss the Kushites as barbarians, but their own records betray frustration. The historian Strabo grudgingly admitted the Kushites were hard to subdue, while Augustus's propaganda, meant to glorify his victories, strangely omitted any mention of crushing Amanirenas. By 21 BCE, Rome, weary of pouring resources into a war with no clear end, offered terms. The treaty they signed was a diplomatic marvel. Kush kept its independence, paid no tribute, and even won tax exemptions for its merchants. In essence, Amanirenas had fought Rome to a standstill. For centuries, historians assumed the Kushite version of events was lost until archaeologists uncovered Amanirenas' pyramid at Marere in the early 1900s. Unlike Egypt's smooth-sided tombs, Kushite pyramids rise steeply, their narrow bases crowned with intricate carvings. Inside hers, fragments of pottery bore Meroitic script, a language still only partially deciphered, but the imagery spoke volumes. A queen receiving divine crowns, leading armies, and facing down foreign envoys. Most striking was the depiction of Augustus, labeled not as conqueror, but as a figure forced to negotiate. The real bombshell came in 2020, when a team re-examining the Temple of Dendur found graffiti hidden under layers of plaster. Alongside Roman symbols were Meroitic inscriptions referencing the Great Agreement, likely the peace treaty itself. Scholars are now torn. Some argue the terms prove Rome never truly recognized Kush's equality, noting Augustus bragged about receiving Kushite envoys, not negotiating with them. Others point to the sheer fact that Rome, which rarely retreated from conquered lands, left Kush intact for centuries after. What's undeniable is Amanirenas' legacy in modern Sudan, where she's celebrated as Kandake, not just a queen but a mother of the nation. School children learn how she turned disability into defiance, her missing eye immortalized in statues as a badge of courage. Meanwhile, Western histories still tiptoe around her, reducing her to a footnote in Rome's imperial saga. But the sand and stone remember. Every time the Nile shifts its course, exposing another Kushite artifact, it whispers the same truth: some defeats are victories in disguise. Artemisia of Caria didn't just command a fleet, she rewrote the rules of naval warfare while surrounded by men who saw her as an outsider. When King Xerxes of Persia mobilized his armada to crush Greece in 480 BCE, his admirals expected unquestioning obedience, but Artemisia, the only woman among Persia's top commanders, had other ideas. As Herodotus recounts, she stood before Xerxes at Salamis, arguing against a direct assault on the Greek ships. "Attack them at sea," she warned, "and you gift them their advantage." When the overconfident king ignored her, she turned his mistake into her masterpiece, fighting so shrewdly that even her enemies praised her. What made Artemisia so formidable wasn't just tactical skill, it was psychological warfare. As ruler of Halicarnassus, a Greek-speaking city under Persian control, she understood Greek minds better than her Persian colleagues. While other admirals sailed in towering triremes to intimidate, she deployed smaller, faster ships, using feints and deception to outmaneuver opponents. During the chaos of Salamis, when her vessel was trapped between Greek attackers, she ordered her crew to raise a Greek flag and ram a nearby Persian ship. The Greeks, assuming she'd switched sides, let her escape, while the Persians saw only a loyal ally ruthlessly crushing a deserter. Herodotus, rarely generous to Persia's forces, wrote that Xerxes, watching from shore, exclaimed, "My men have become women and my woman a man." Yet this same brilliance made later historians deeply uncomfortable. Greek chroniclers, unable to reconcile a woman outperforming their heroes, spun her as a traitor or a desperate renegade. Some claimed she fought only to save her city from Persian wrath. Others painted her as a bloodthirsty anomaly. Modern scholars, however, see a more nuanced picture. Coins minted under her rule show a lioness, not the usual male symbols of power. Her later reign suggests she was no puppet but a calculating leader who leveraged Persian might to secure her own autonomy. The traitor narrative likely stems from her pragmatic survival instincts, switching alliances when Xerxes' invasion crumbled. ensuring Halicarnassus thrived long after Persia's defeat. The most telling clue to her legacy lies in what wasn't destroyed. When Alexander the Great stormed through Anatolia centuries later, he razed Halicarnassus except for Artemisia's tomb. A towering marble monument so magnificent it became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It stood untouched, as if even conquerors feared the wrath of a queen who refused to be erased. Today, her tactics are studied in naval academies, yet few textbooks name her among history's great admirals. Perhaps because admitting her genius means admitting how long we've underestimated the women who shaped warfare, not from the shadows but from the helm. The desert city of Palmyra gleamed like a mirage, a bustling oasis where Roman columns stood beside Arabian souks, and Silk Road caravans offloaded spices under statues of both Jupiter and Baal. Here, in the 3rd century, 2 queens defied expectations, ruling a multicultural empire that stretched from Egypt to Anatolia. But where Septimia Bat-Zabai wielded diplomacy like a scalpel, her successor Zenobia swung a sword, proving that resistance could wear many faces. Together, their reigns reveal the delicate dance of power between Rome and its restive provinces, and how quickly admiration could turn to ashes. Septimia's rule began not with conquest but with calculated pragmatism. When her husband Odenathus became Rome's unlikely ally, crushing Persian invaders and securing the eastern frontier, she mastered the art of dual allegiance. Official inscriptions called her Queen of Palmyra in Aramaic but most illustrious senator in Latin, a wink to both identities. She patronized scholars who translated Greek philosophy into Aramaic, built temples blending Roman and Semitic gods, and even minted coins with her face beside Emperor Gallienus's, unthinkable for most client rulers. Yet beneath the velvet glove was steel. When Odenathus and his heir were assassinated, likely by Roman agents fearing their growing power, Septimia shielded her young son Vabilathus while quietly consolidating control. Her genius lay in making submission look like strength, paying tribute to Rome while expanding Palmyra's trade networks until the city rivaled Alexandria in wealth. Zenobia, her protégé and possibly daughter-in-law, chose fire where Septimia had used embers. When Rome descended into civil war after Emperor Gallienus's death, she saw chaos as opportunity. Declaring Vabilathus emperor with herself as regent, she seized Egypt, marched into Asia Minor and courted Persian allies, all while insisting she acted as Rome's loyal deputy. Her audacity was breathtaking. She styled herself the new Cleopatra, hosting philosophers at court while her general Zabdas crushed Roman legions at Antioch. For 5 years, she ruled an empire within an empire, even briefly controlling the grain supply that fed Rome itself. Yet her downfall came not from weakness but overreach. When Emperor Aurelian turned his battle-hardened troops east, Zenobia gambled everything on one pitched battle and lost. Palmyra fell, her dream of a united East shattered. The aftermath reveals Rome's uneasy relationship with powerful women. Aurelian paraded Zenobia in golden chains through Rome, yet spared her life, a mercy meant to humiliate. Ancient sources, fixated on spectacle, claimed she collapsed in cowardice, but the archaeology tells another story. Palmyra's ruins show systematic destruction. Temples razed, statues defaced, even the palm groves that gave the city its name set ablaze. This wasn't just punishment, it was cultural erasure. Meanwhile, Zenobia's fate remains intriguingly vague. Some say she married a Roman senator, others that she starved herself in protest. Either way, her legend grew, morphing into Bedouin folktales of a warrior queen who chose death over chains. What makes their dual legacy so compelling is how it mirrors modern struggles for cultural autonomy. Septimia proved collaboration could be resistance, using Rome's tools to preserve Arab identity. Zenobia, by contrast, weaponized that identity, gambling that Rome was too weak to stop her. Both strategies failed, yet their city's ruins, now tragically ravaged again by modern conflict, still whisper a defiant truth. power isn't just about winning. Sometimes it's about daring to redefine the game. The name Sobekneferu should have echoed through history as a landmark, the first woman confirmed to rule Egypt as full pharaoh, not just regent or co-ruler. Yet for millennia, her reign barely registered, slipped between the cracks of king lists like a secret too dangerous to tell. Her story begins at the twilight of Egypt's 12th dynasty, around 1800 CE, when the Nile's floods faltered and the kingdom teetered on collapse. Her father, Amenemhat III, had ruled for 45 years, but his male heirs predeceased him, leaving Sobekneferu, his daughter, possibly his only surviving child, to inherit a crumbling throne. What happened next reads like a historical whodunit. Ancient records list her reign as lasting just under 4 years, but the details are suspiciously sparse. Later king lists, like the famed Turin canon, either omit her entirely or truncate her rule to a footnote. Even Manetho, Egypt's 3rd century BCE historian, reduced her to a vague mention of a woman who ruled. For centuries, scholars debated whether she'd even existed until the statues spoke. In the late 19th century, archaeologists excavating the ruins of Hawara, Amenemhat's pyramid complex, unearthed fragments of a royal figure wearing the Nemes headcloth and shendit kilt, traditional male pharaonic garb. The torso bore a name, Sobekneferu, Beauty of Sobek. Then came the clincher. A bust now in the Metropolitan Museum clearly shows her feminine features framed by the striped headdress, her face serene but authoritative. The artistry is deliberate, blending masculine symbols of power with feminine grace. Unlike Hatshepsut's later extreme masculinization, Sobekneferu's depictions whisper a subtler truth. She ruled not by erasing her womanhood, but by expanding what a ruler could look like. But why was she nearly erased? Theories abound. Some suggest her reign coincided with calamity, low Nile floods, famine, the dynasty's abrupt end, making her a convenient scapegoat. Others point to the 13th dynasty's founders, who may have purged her from records to legitimize their own shaky claims. The most tantalizing clue lies in her name's fate. While her statues were defaced, they weren't pulverized like Hatshepsut's. Instead, they were hidden, stacked in ritual burials, as if someone wanted her memory preserved but out of sight. Recent discoveries add layers to the mystery. In 2019, radiocarbon dating of seals from her reign confirmed she ruled long enough to issue administrative decrees, proving she wasn't a fleeting placeholder. Even more telling are the monuments she completed, including her father's labyrinthine mortuary temple, a project so vast Herodotus later called it more impressive than the pyramids. Finishing a predecessor's tomb was a pharaoh's duty, but Sobekneferu went further. At Heracleopolis, she erected statues pairing her image with the crocodile god Sobek, boldly claiming divine kinship. The greatest irony, her erasure may have preserved her. Because later rulers tried to forget her, her artifacts avoided the recycling that destroyed countless others. Today, every fragment rediscovered a seal here. A statue there feels like a message in a bottle from a queen who refused to vanish. Unlike her more famous successors, Sobekneferu never had to justify her right to rule. She simply did, wearing the crown as naturally as her father before her. And in that quiet confidence, she proved something revolutionary. The first female pharaoh didn't need to shout. Her existence was rebellion enough. The Adriatic Sea in the 3rd century BCE wasn't just a body of water. It was a battleground of empires where Rome's growing hunger for control clashed with an Illyrian queen who refused to bow. Juta of Illyria didn't inherit a peaceful kingdom. She seized power after her husband's death, ruling over a coalition of tribes whose survival depended on the sea. To Rome, she was a pirate queen terrorizing their trade routes. To her people, she was a defender of their ancient way of life, one where raiding wasn't crime but tradition. And when Rome demanded she reign in her ships, her response became legendary. It's never been our custom to prevent private citizens from taking prizes at sea. That defiance ignited a war few thought she could win. Roman historians like Polybius painted Tutor as a bloodthirsty rogue, claiming she murdered envoys and laughed as her pirates plundered. But Illyrian oral traditions tell a different story of a widow protecting her people from economic strangulation. Rome's ultimatum wasn't just about piracy, it was a demand to dismantle Illyria's naval power, their only leverage against colonies choking their ports. Tutor's pirates were often fishermen turned raiders, retaliating against Greek and Roman ships monopolizing Adriatic trade. When she refused to disarm them, Rome sent consuls with 200 ships expecting a swift surrender. What followed was a guerrilla war at sea that stunned Rome's admirals. Illyrian lembi light, fast ships with single sails dodged bulky Roman galleys, striking supply lines and vanishing into coastal inlets. Tutor's forces fortified mountain strongholds like Rhizon, where narrow passes turned Roman numerical advantage into a liability. For 2 brutal years she held out until betrayal from within forced her retreat to a cliffside fortress. Even in defeat, she bargained shrewdly, keeping her throne but surrendering only a sliver of territory, a compromise Rome accepted because the cost of crushing her completely proved too high. The aftermath reveals how history gets written by the victors. Roman records claim Tutor died by suicide, too proud to live under occupation. But Illyrian ballads sing of her slipping away to the highlands, rallying tribes for future revolts. That duality, villain or folk hero, depends on who's telling the tale. Modern Albanians revere her as a symbol of resistance, her name invoked by everyone from medieval rebels to 20th century partisans. Meanwhile, Roman historians buried her legacy under labels like pirate, obscuring a critical truth. Tutor wasn't plundering for greed, but fighting to preserve a world Rome was determined to erase. The most telling evidence lies in what changed after her fall. Rome didn't just punish Illyria, they rewrote maritime law, branding all unauthorized sea raids as piracy, a definition that conveniently targeted their enemies. Tutor's real crime wasn't lawlessness, it was proving small nations could strike back. Today, when fishermen off Croatia's coast find Roman anchors crusted with barnacles, they're not just relics of empire, they're reminders of the queen who dared to rock the boat. Himiko's story begins not in Japan's official histories, but in the ink of Chinese scribes, an outsider's glimpse into a shrouded chapter of the island's past. The 3rd century text Weijai describes a mysterious ruler named Himiko, a shaman queen who commanded the respect of 100 tribes without ever lifting a sword. She lived cloistered in a palace guarded by 1,000 women, communicating with the gods while her brother handled earthly affairs. To the Chinese envoys who visited her court, she was a marvel, a woman who wielded divine authority in a land where such power was unheard of. But in Japan's own earliest chronicles, compiled centuries later, her name is conspicuously absent. So who was this vanished queen, and why was her legacy so carefully erased? The key lies in the shifting tides of power and religion. Himiko's reign coincides with the Yayoi period, a time when Japan's clans were consolidating under regional chiefs, and shamans, often women, acted as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual world. The Chinese accounts describe her as ruling Yamatai Koku, a shadowy kingdom scholars still debate locating. Some place it in northern Kyushu, where bronze mirrors linked to her reign have been unearthed. Others argue for the Kinai region, pointing to massive keyhole-shaped tombs that emerged soon after her era. What's clear is that her authority wasn't rooted in military might, but in her perceived connection to the kami, the spirits woven into Japan's landscape. The controversy around Himiko isn't just about her existence, it's about what she represents. Later Japanese chroniclers, crafting origin myths for the imperial line, had no room for a queen who derived power from ecstatic trances rather than divine ancestry. By the time the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki were written in the 8th century, the Yamato court had firmly tied sovereignty to male emperors claiming descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. A shamaness like Himiko, whose legitimacy came from spiritual prowess rather than bloodline, was an inconvenient precedent. Archaeology, however, refuses to let her fade. In 2009, a dig at the Makamuku ruins in Nara uncovered a trove of artifact ceremonial beads, bronze mirrors identical to those gifted by China's Wei dynasty, and the remains of a sprawling settlement matching the Wei Zhai's descriptions. Even more telling are the Dotaku bells found across western Japan, ritual objects used by female shamans. Their sudden disappearance in the 3rd century hints at a cultural shift, as Yamatai's spiritual rule gave way to Yamato's militarized monarchy. The most striking clue to Himiko's erasure lies in what came after, the very tombs that may mark her successor's rise. The coffin, some over 400 meters long, are devoid of inscriptions, as if the new rulers were desperate to sever ties with the past. Yet in the quiet villages of Kyushu, elderly women still perform Kagyura dances channeling deities, their movements echoing rituals Himiko might have known. The Chinese called her a queen, but perhaps she was something far more radical, a living bridge between worlds whose truth was too dangerous to preserve and too powerful to forget. The Red River Delta simmered with rebellion in the year 40, not just against foreign rule, but against the very idea that women couldn't lead a war. Trong Trak and Trong Nhi, aristocratic sisters raised on tales of Vietnamese heroes, watched as Chinese governors tightened their grip, demanding higher taxes, conscripting men for distant wars, and imposing customs that erased local traditions. When Trak's husband, a dissenting noble, was executed for protest, the sisters didn't mourn in silence. They gathered 36 female generals, many from elite families, others former peasants, and raised an army of 80,000, uniting fractured tribes under a single banner, freedom or death. What happened next wasn't just a revolt, it was a spectacle of defiance. The sisters rode into battle atop war elephants, clad in golden armor, their troops carrying banners embroidered with the words "Righteous Fury." Within months, they stormed 65 Chinese-held citadels, driving the occupiers north across the border. For 3 years, they ruled an independent Vietnam with Trak as queen, a government that, according to fragmentary records, elevated women to unprecedented roles. Provincial governors, military commanders, even palace advisors were female, a radical departure from Confucian norms. Coins minted during their brief reign bore not emperors but twin phoenixes rising. Chinese chroniclers, baffled by this inversion of the natural order, dismissed the sisters as Amazons led by emotion rather than strategy, but their tactics reveal cold precision. They exploited monsoon floods to trap Chinese reinforcements, used guerrilla strikes to disrupt supply lines, and most brilliantly leveraged their knowledge of mountainous terrain to neutralize the enemy's superior numbers. When Chinese General Ma Yuan finally crushed their forces in 43, it wasn't due to military failure but betrayal. Legend claims their troops, surrounded and outnumbered, chose to drown themselves in the Hatjiang River rather than surrender, a mass act of defiance that still echoes in Vietnamese poetry. The aftermath was brutal. Ma Yuan ordered the sisters' supporters executed, their books burned, and their traditions suppressed, yet their legacy proved indestructible. Village shrines secretly venerated them as Hai Ba Trung, the two ladies Trung, and today their statues dominate Hanoi streets clad in battle robes, swords eternally drawn. Modern Vietnam celebrates them not just as patriots but as feminist revolutionaries. Schoolgirls recite poems about their courage, and their uprising is reenacted in annual festivals where women don armor to stomp on straw effigies of Chinese generals. The greatest testament to their impact lies in the discomfort they still provoke. Official Chinese histories barely mention them, while Confucian scholars once labeled their rebellion unnatural. But in the 21st century, their story has found new resonance. From TikTok videos pairing their speeches with electronic music to political rallies where their faces adorn protest signs. They remind us that some revolutions fail on the battlefield but win the far more enduring war, the fight for memory. Every time a Vietnamese woman runs for office, leads a company, or challenges tradition, she channels the spirit of two sisters who looked at an empire and said, "This far, no further." Cleopatra Thea didn't just play the Game of Thrones, she rewrote the rules with poison, dynastic marriages, and cold-blooded strategy that would make Machiavelli shudder. While her more famous namesake, Cleopatra VII, is remembered for her romances with Rome's generals, Thea's legacy was forged in the brutal arena of Seleucid Syria, where survival meant outmaneuvering husbands, sons, and rivals alike. Her reign wasn't about love or legend, it was about control, and she wielded it with terrifying precision. Her story begins with a pawn's position. Married off at 16 to the Macedonian king Alexander Ballas as a political bargaining chip, she quickly learned that in Syria's court, loyalty was a luxury no one could afford. When her father, Ptolemy VI of Egypt, switched sides and backed her husband's rival, Demetrius II, Thea didn't hesitate. She abandoned Alexander, married Demetrius, and watched as her first husband was slaughtered in battle. But Demetrius proved just as expendable. After years of his brutal rule sparked rebellion, Thea aligned with the usurper Antiochus VI, a boy king controlled by her father's general. When Antiochus mysteriously died, she married the general himself, now King Tryphon. 3 kings, 3 marriages, each a calculated step up the ladder. Then came her masterpiece of ruthlessness. After Tryphon's downfall, she ruled as regent for her son by Demetrius, Seleucus V, until he dared claim the throne without her consent. Ancient historians like Justin claim she handed him a poisoned cup, murmuring something about learning patience. With her next son, Antiochus VIII, she tried subtler control until he rebelled, forcing her to drink her own poison in a bitter twist of fate. Yet even in failure, Thea's cunning shone. She'd spent decades balancing factions, playing Rome and Egypt against each other, and keeping Syria intact through sheer will. The contrast with Cleopatra VII is stark. While the Egyptian queen used alliances with Caesar and Antony to preserve her kingdom's independence, Thea's power plays were inward-facing survival in a snake pit of familial betrayal. Where Cleopatra's story is draped in tragic romance, Thea's is bare-knuckled pragmatism. Modern scholars debate her villainy. Was she a monster or a mother forced to monstrous acts? Syrian chronicles paint her as a stabilizing force in a fracturing empire, while Roman writers cast her as the epitome of Eastern decadence. The artifacts tell their own story. Coins minted under her rule show her alongside sons, their faces nearly identical, a visual assertion of dynastic continuity. But look closer, her image is always slightly larger, her gaze more commanding. In the ruins of Antioch, archaeologists found a tile bearing her name stacked beneath later constructions, as if someone tried to bury her memory, yet her influence lingered. Decades after her death, her descendants still invoked her name to legitimize their rule. Cleopatra Thea's legacy isn't carved in monuments but in the quiet terror of her example, proof that in a world where kings were disposable, a queen could be the last one standing. Her reign whispers an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the greatest survivors are those history is too unsettled to celebrate. The highlands of Ethiopia still whisper Gud, its name like a curse or a rallying cry. In the 10th century, as Christian Axum's golden age waned, a queen emerged from the shadows to tear down its holiest symbols. The Axumite chronicles call her the Fire Woman, a destroyer who burned churches, shattered towering obelisks, and left the royal dynasty in ruins. But dig deeper and her story fractures into a dozen conflicting versions. Was she a Jewish rebel striking at Christianity's heart, a pagan warlord seizing power, or simply a woman written into history as a monster because she dared to win? The mystery begins with the scars she left. Axum's sacred sites, once glittering with gold crosses, show layers of ash dating to her era. The great stelae monolithic spires marking royal tombs lie in fragments, their collapse too systematic to be accidental, yet the most damning evidence comes from outsider accounts. The Arab historian Ibn Hawqal wrote of a non-Christian queen who slaughtered Aksum's rulers, while Coptic Egyptian texts blame Yodit for cutting off their patriarch's contact with Ethiopian Christians. Strikingly, no contemporary Ethiopian Christian sources describe her directly, as if her very name was too dangerous to record, but whose queen was she? Some scholars point to oral traditions from Ethiopia's Beta Israel community, which tell of a Jewish ruler named Gudit or Asato who resisted forced conversions. Aksum's kings had long claimed descent from the biblical Solomon, wielding Christianity as a tool of control. If Gudit was Jewish or even just Aksumite, her attacks on churches weren't mindless vandalism, but calculated strikes at the state's ideological core. Others argue she was a Sidamo or Agor chieftain, capitalizing on Aksum's weakening grip to assert her people's independence. The truth may lie in between. Coins minted during this chaotic period show neither crosses nor Jewish symbols, but abstract designs suggesting Gudit rejected both religions' political baggage. The darkest twist comes from Ethiopian royal chronicles written centuries later. They claim Gudit wasn't just a conqueror, but a usurper who married the last Aksumite king's son, then had him murdered to found her own dynasty. If true, her strategy mirrors Wu Zetian's in China, using marriage as a stepping stone to absolute power. Yet unlike Wu, Gudit left no monuments to herself. The only evidence of her reign is destruction, a void where Aksumite glory once stood. Modern archaeologists are peeling back the layers of propaganda. Excavations at Aksum reveal that while churches burned, the city wasn't abandoned. Trade goods from as far as India and Byzantium still flowed during her alleged reign, hinting at a ruler savvy enough to maintain economic ties even while dismantling religious power. Most telling is the discovery of a hidden tomb beneath the ruined cathedral, its contents looted, but its walls bearing faint carvings of a woman's face crowned not with a cross but a sun disk. Gudit's legacy splits Ethiopia even today. To some, she's a devil who nearly erased Christianity from the region. To others, a freedom fighter who challenged an oppressive theocracy. Perhaps both are true or neither. The silence where her voice should be speaks volumes. History belongs to those who write it unless someone burns the pages first. The deserts of Arabia in the 8th century BCE weren't just barren wasteland, they were a chessboard where a queen named Samsi outmaneuvered an empire. When Assyria's Tiglath-Pileser Roman III, history's first true imperialist, turned his armies south, demanding tribute from the nomadic tribes, he expected submission. What he got was a coalition of Bedouin warriors led by a woman who understood the sands better than any conqueror. The cuneiform tablets chronicling their clash reveal something extraordinary. A queen who lost the battle but won the war, securing her people's survival through shrewd diplomacy when steel failed. Samsi's power base lay in Kedar, a confederation of tribes stretching from modern Jordan to northern Saudi Arabia. Unlike sedentary rulers, her authority wasn't rooted in walled cities but in alliances forged through kinship, trade, and shared resistance to outsiders. When Tiglath-Pileser's envoys demanded her surrender, she responded by uniting rival clans under a single banner, a feat historians once thought impossible for the famously fractious Bedouin. Assyrian records grudgingly admit her forces inflicted heavy casualties before being overwhelmed, a rarity in their usual accounts of total victory. What happened next defies the typical script of conquest. Instead of executing Samsi, Tiglath-Pileser reinstated her as a vassal ruler. The Nineveh tablets describe this not as mercy but pragmatism. Trying to govern the desert through direct rule would have bled Assyria dry. Samsi, understanding the limits of rebellion, played the long game. She paid nominal tribute but retained control of the incense trade routes, funneling wealth back to her people while keeping Assyrian overseers at arm's length. Her real masterstroke, using her defeat to strengthen her position. By positioning herself as the only leader capable of negotiating with Assyria, she became indispensable to both her subjects and their conquerors. The proof of her success lies in what the tablets don't say. After her reinstatement, mentions of Assyrian campaigns in Arabia drop sharply. No records of rebellions, no lists of deportees, just silence, suggesting Samsi maintained peace without sacrificing autonomy. Recent excavations at Tama, a key caravan city in her territory, uncovered seals bearing her name alongside Assyrian motifs, evidence of cultural blending rather than subjugation. Even her name hints at her legacy. Samsi likely derives from Shams, the sun goddess worshipped across Arabia, a deliberate echo of divine authority that resonated deeper than any imperial decree. The irony, Samsi's negotiated surrender preserved her people's way of life longer than outright resistance could have. While Assyria's empire crumbled within centuries, Bedouin traditions of decentralized leadership endured and still do today. When archaeologists piece together broken tablets recounting her reign, they're not just restoring a queen's story, they're decoding the oldest play in the underdog's handbook. Sometimes bending is the surest way to never break. Pujuhepa's quill didn't just write letters, it rewrote history. In the dusty archives of Hattusa, the Hittite capital, clay tablets bear her seal beside phrases like Great Queen and Beloved of the Goddess, titles no woman before her had wielded with such authority. When her husband, King Hattusili III, ascended the throne in the 13th century B.C.E., Pujuhepa didn't settle for ceremonial duties. She became the architect of diplomacy, negotiating with Egypt's Ramses II and his queen, Nefertari, to finalize the Treaty of Kadesh, the world's first recorded peace accord. But this wasn't just royal correspondence, it was a masterclass in soft power, where every cuneiform stroke balanced flattery, threats, and shrewd compromise. The stakes couldn't have been higher. After decades of war between the Hittites and Egyptians, both empires were bleeding resources. Pujuhepa recognized that peace required more than a ceasefire, it needed pageantry. Her letters to Nefertari, discovered at Deir el-Medina, drip with calculated warmth, addressing her as sister and gifting perfumed oils to gladden the heart. Meanwhile, her missives to Ramses alternated between reminding him of Hittite military might and appealing to his ego, calling him the sun whose brilliance illuminates all lands. The treaty itself, etched in silver and adorned with God's seals, was her triumph. Not just an end to hostilities, but a mutual defense pact, an extradition agreement so forward-thinking it wouldn't be matched for centuries. Yet her influence stretched far beyond foreign policy. As high priestess of the storm god Teshub, Pujuhepa reformed Hittite religion, merging Hurrian and Hittite deities into a unified pantheon to strengthen cultural cohesion. Legal texts from her reign reveal her hand in groundbreaking reforms, protecting women's rights in marriage contracts, standardizing temple finances, and even adjudicating cases herself. One tablet records her ruling in a property dispute between two merchants, her verdict invoking both divine will and precedent. The most telling clue to her legacy lies in how contemporaries saw her. A letter from the king of Ugarit begs her, not Hattusili, to mediate a conflict, while Egyptian scribes included her name alongside kings in diplomatic scrolls. After Hattusili's death, she co-ruled with her son. Tutankhamun's widow even proposed marriage to him, a move scholars believe Pujuhepa engineered to secure Hittite-Egyptian ties. Modern archaeology keeps proving her brilliance. In 2009, linguists decoding a fractured tablet found her marginal notes correcting a junior scribe's treaty draft. Elsewhere, seals bearing her name appear on tax records, temple inventories, even military orders. This wasn't a queen content with symbolism, she governed down to the last grain of barley. Hatshepsut's story shatters the myth that ancient women wielded power only through manipulation or motherhood. Her authority was direct, her intellect unmatched. When historians call the Treaty of Kadesh the first step toward international law, they're really crediting a queen who understood that lasting peace begins not on battlefields, but in the quiet intensity of a well-crafted word. Nzinga Mban didn't just resist the Portuguese slavers invading her kingdom. She waged a 4-decade masterclass in defiance, turning the jungles of Ndongo and Matamba into a labyrinth of traps, spies, and shifting alliances. When the Portuguese governor first demanded her submission in 1622, they expected a quick conquest. Instead, they got a ruler who matched their cruelty with cunning, their firepower with psychological warfare, and their arrogance with sheer, unbreakable will. The showdown began with a now legendary meeting. Summoned to negotiate, Nzinga arrived in Luanda not as a supplicant but as an equal. Portuguese accounts describe her seated on a kneeling servant, a deliberate power move ensuring she looked the governor eye to eye. When they refused to offer her a chair, she turned the insult into theater, proving she'd kneel for no one. The treaty she walked away with was a temporary truce, and Nzinga knew the Portuguese would break it. So she prepared her first stroke of genius, abandoning the capital. As Portuguese forces advanced, she burned Ndongo's royal city to the ground, leaving them nothing to pillage. Her people melted into the highlands, where she built a new fortress at Matamba, surrounded by marshes and ambush points. From here, she launched raids so relentless that Portuguese soldiers began calling her the Black Queen of the Night. But Nzinga's brilliance wasn't just in fighting, it was in rewriting the rules of engagement. She armed former slaves, trained women as archers, and even formed an all-female bodyguard unit, the Quilombo, whose loyalty was absolute. Then came the Dutch Gambit. In 1641, she spotted an opportunity. The Dutch West India Company, Portugal's bitter rival, had seized Luanda. Nzinga immediately sent envoys offering trade and military alliance. For 8 years, her forces fought alongside Dutch troops, pushing the Portuguese to the brink. When the Dutch eventually withdrew, Nzinga didn't collapse, she adapted. She married off her sisters to rival chiefs, weaving a web of alliances that kept her enemies divided. She even temporarily converted to Christianity, not out of faith, but to court Capuchin missionaries whose influence could shield her people. The Capuchin friars' newly translated letters reveal a court buzzing with strategy. One friar, Giovanni Cavazzi, wrote of Nzinga holding war councils at midnight, her commanders debating whether to poison wells or flood valleys. Another described her presiding over mock battles with wooden dolls, planning every counterattack. Most startling are the accounts of her psychological operations, ordering her troops to wear Portuguese uniforms during raids, spreading rumors she could summon storms, even leaving cryptic warnings carved into trees. By the time of her death in 1663, Nzinga had forced Portugal to recognize Matamba's independence, a feat no other African ruler achieved. But her true victory was in the shadows. Census records show slave raids plummeted in her territories during her reign, and oral histories still recount how she'd sneak into enemy camps disguised as a trader, listening for weaknesses. Today, her statue in Luanda shows her barefoot, a bow in one hand and a treaty in the other, a reminder that resistance takes many forms. The Portuguese wrote her off as a savage. History now knows her as the woman who taught empires what fear really was. Theodora of Constantinople didn't climb the social ladder. She burned it and built a throne from the ashes. Born in 500 A.D., to a bear keeper and an actress in the Hippodrome's shadows, her early life was a blur of purple dye staining her fingers at the wool factories, then scandalizing elites as a teenage pantomime dancer. Ancient sources sneered at her profession code for work that blurred the lines between entertainment and sex work, but Theodora weaponized every whisper. By 20, she'd transformed from a discarded mistress to the most powerful woman in Byzantium. proving that in the game of empires, reputation was just another prop to be rewritten. Her turning point came when she caught the eye of Justinian, heir to Emperor Justin I. Most noblemen would have hidden a lover with her past, but Justinian didn't just marry her. He changed imperial law to allow actresses to wed aristocrats, then made her his co-ruler in all but name. The court bristled, senators muttered about the brothel on the throne, until the Nika revolt of 532, when Theodora's steel backbone saved the empire. As rioters torched Constantinople, demanding Justinian's overthrow, the emperor's advisors urged flight. Theodora's response became legendary: "Purple makes a fine shroud." Her speech, recorded by historian Procopius, who hated her, was a masterclass in turning fragility into strength. She refused to abandon the city, convincing Justinian to crush the revolt with mercenary troops. 30,000 bodies later, the message was clear: this was her empire too, but Theodora's real power lay in legislation. She turned her trauma into law, banning the forced prostitution of actresses, expanding divorce rights for women, and establishing convents as safe havens for former sex workers. She even decreed death for rapists, unheard of in an era that treated women as property. Procopius's secret history, with its lurid tales of her alleged debauchery, was likely political sabotage, attacking her reforms by smearing her past. Archaeology tells a different story. Mosaics in Ravenna show her radiant in purple silk, flanked by female attendants holding jeweled chalices not as ornaments but as equals. Newly deciphered payroll tablets reveal she paid her staff equally, regardless of gender, and the greatest irony, Theodora's laws outlasted Justinian's conquests, quietly reshaping Byzantine society long after her death. The girl they called a whore became the woman history remembers as the architect of justice. Razia Sultan didn't just inherit a throne, she seized history by the collar and refused to let go. In 1236, when Delhi's nobility awoke to the news that Sultan Iltutmish had named his daughter as heir over his incompetent sons, the court nearly erupted in revolt. A woman ruling the Delhi Sultanate, unthinkable. But Razia wasn't just any princess. She'd spent years at her father's side, mastering statecraft while her brothers caroused. When the nobles installed her brother Ruknuddin instead, she bided her time. Within months, his drunken tyranny turned the people against him, and Razia marched into the capital dressed not in veils, but in warrior's armor, the crowd chanting her name. Her reign began with revolutionary symbolism. Persian miniatures from the era show her holding court in a tunic and turban, her face uncovered, issuing decrees while seated beside, not behind, male advisors. Chroniclers gasped at her insistence on wearing men's clothing for state affairs, missing the point entirely. This wasn't about fashion, it was a visual manifesto. If a sultan's authority flowed from his masculine image, she would embody it completely. Even her coins bore the unprecedented title, Sultan, the masculine form rather than the customary Sultana. But Razia's true disruption lay in governance. She abolished the jizya tax on non-Muslims, appointed Hindus to high offices based on merit, and personally reviewed petitions from commoners. Her closest advisor, Jamal ad-Din Yaqut, was an Abyssinian slave turned general, a promotion so scandalous that nobles spread rumors they were lovers. Modern historians find no evidence of this. More likely, Yaqut's competence threatened their privilege. The Persian writer Minhaj-i-Siraj, who knew Razia personally, recorded her scathing rebuke to noblemen demanding Yaqut's dismissal. "You measure a man by his ancestry, not his actions." That is why this empire stumbles. The backlash came swiftly. In 1240, while inspecting rebellious provinces, Razia found herself ambushed by nobles who'd conspired with her estranged brother, Muizuddin. Yaqut was killed protecting her, and she was forcibly married to her captor, Altunia, a humiliating attempt to tame her through wedlock. But Razia, ever the strategist, turned the tables. She convinced Altunia to join her in retaking Delhi, only for both to be slaughtered by Muizuddin's forces days later. The tragedy isn't just in her death, but in how history remembers her. Islamic chronicles of the time, like Tabakat-i-Nasiri, reduce her to cautionary tale, a woman who strayed from her place and paid the price. But look closer at those Persian miniatures, the way artists lingered on her fingers gripping a sword hilt, the deliberate scale making her figure loom over cowering nobles. These weren't criticisms, they were quiet acts of subversion. Even the ruins of her unfinished mosque near Delhi tell a story. Its foundations show spaces for female scholars to teach, a radical vision cut short. Centuries later, Razia's legacy pulses through South Asia's feminist movements. Pakistani textbooks hail her as a national icon, while Indian activists invoke her name against religious patriarchy. The most poignant tribute, the pants she was murdered for, are now standard uniform for policewomen across the subcontinent. A silent army walking in the footsteps of a sultan who dared to lead as her brother's equal. The steppes of Central Asia have a way of swallowing empires whole, and in 600 BCE, the great Cyrus of Persia learned this lesson from a queen who turned the desert red. Thomiris, ruler of the nomadic Massagetae, wasn't just defending her territory when she faced down history's first superpower. She was crafting a legend so brutal, even Herodotus hesitated while recording it. The story begins with Cyrus, fresh from conquering Babylon, setting his sights eastward onto the grasslands between the Caspian and Aral seas. His tactic: deception, knowing the Massagetae revered wine as sacred yet unfamiliar with its effects. He left behind a camp stocked with barrels, waiting for Thomiris warriors to drink themselves into a stupor. When they did, his troops struck, slaughtering revelers and capturing her son, Spargapises. What happened next depends on who tells the tale. Herodotus claims the young prince, humiliated in chains, begged for release, only to seize the moment and kill himself. But Kazakh oral epics, passed down for centuries, tell it differently. Spargapises spat in Cyrus's face before wrenching a dagger from a guard and falling on it, a death worthy of song. Either way, Thomiris' response was apocalyptic. She sent a message that chilled even Cyrus. "I swear by the sun, I will give you more blood than you can drink." The battle that followed was less a clash of armies than a reckoning. Thomiris lured Cyrus' forces deep into the steppe, where the Persians' heavy chariots bogged down in the sand. Massagetae horse archers, firing backward at full gallop, a tactic later called the Parthian shot, picked off stragglers while Thomiris herself led the center, her golden scale armor glinting like a warning. When Cyrus fell, the queen didn't just claim victory, she performed a ritual so visceral it became myth. Herodotus insists she plunged his severed head into a wineskin filled with blood, snarling, "You thirsted for it, now drink." Yet in Turkmen versions of the story, it's not wine but fermented mare's milk, a sacred libation meant to curse his soul. Archaeology adds layers to the mystery. Near the ancient Oxus River, a shattered Persian helmet was found with a Scythian arrow lodged in the eye-slit carbon dated to Cyrus' era. More telling are the Massagetae burial mounds nearby, where women lie entombed with swords and quivers, their skeletons showing battle fractures. These weren't just ceremonial graves, they were proof of a culture where queens rode to war as equals. The real dispute isn't whether Thomiris won, but how we remember her victory. Greek historians framed her as a barbarian avenger, while Persian records omit the defeat entirely. Modern Kazakhs, though, reclaim her as a national hero. Their currency bears her profile, and mothers still tell children of the day a queen made an empire kneel. Perhaps the greatest evidence of her impact lies in what Cyrus' successors did next. For generations, Persian kings avoided the steppes, as if the land itself whispered a warning written in blood. Jindiok of Silla didn't rule during a golden age, she carved one out of desperation. When famine gripped Korea's ancient kingdom in the 7th century, withered crops and hollow stomachs threatened to collapse the dynasty. But this queen, often dismissed as a mere placeholder in later Confucian chronicles, didn't just pray for rain. She turned diplomacy into a lifeline. While her male predecessors had traded threats with Tang China, Jindeok sent envoys bearing poetry, not swords. Her letters to Emperor Taizong, preserved in fragments at the tombs of Zetian, flattered his ego while underscoring shared Confucian ideals of benevolent rule. The result, ships laden with Chinese grain soon docked at Scylla's ports, staving off starvation and buying time for her real masterstroke, agrarian reform. Recent excavations at Gyeongju, Scylla's ancient capital, reveal how radical those reforms were. Ledgers etched on wooden tablets detail her orders to redistribute fallow noble lands to peasant farmers, a move that would have enraged the aristocracy. Archaeologists unearthed storehouses lined with carbonized millet, proof her policies worked. But the most telling discovery came in 2018, when a team scanning a royal tomb long attributed to a male king found silver hairpins and a seal bearing Jindeok's name. The burial's lavishness, gold filigreed shoes, jade ornaments matched only Scylla's greatest rulers, yet her reign was conspicuously absent from official histories. The erasure was deliberate. Centuries later, Confucian scholars were writing Scylla's past couldn't reconcile a woman succeeding where men had failed. They shortened her reign to a footnote, attributing the famine's end to heavenly favor rather than her negotiations. But the people remembered. Folk tales from the countryside still speak of a queen who sold her jewels to fund irrigation canals, while shamanic rituals in rural Gyeongju invoke her name during droughts. Even the Tang records, though peppered with condescension, admit she outmaneuvered them, securing grain without surrendering an inch of territory. The greatest irony lies in what followed. The very Confucian scholars who erased her laid the groundwork for Scylla's unification of Korea, a feat built on the stability she'd forged. Today, as historians pore over the Gyeongju tablets, they're not just restoring a queen's legacy, they're uncovering a blueprint for leadership that valued rice over rhetoric and left a kingdom too strong to starve. Shajar al-Durr's rise from slave to sultana wasn't just a twist of fate, it was a masterclass in survival during the bloodiest chess game of the Crusades. Born into the shadows of the Turkic slave trade, she entered the Ayyubid court as a concubine, only to captivate Sultan as Salih Ayyub with a razor-sharp mind. When he marched to face the Crusaders in 1249, he left Shajar not in the harem but in command of his armies. And when news came of his sudden death, she didn't collapse in grief. She orchestrated one of history's most audacious cover-ups. For 3 months, she hid his corpse in the palace, issuing decrees in his name while secretly running Egypt herself. The moment of truth came when Louis IX of France, convinced Egypt was leaderless, marched his crusader forces toward Cairo. Shajar's response was pure political theater. She unveiled the Sultan's death, then immediately married the Mamluk general Aybak, declaring herself Khalil, mother of the prince, and taking the throne as co-ruler. The move wasn't just bold, it was revolutionary. No woman had ruled Egypt since Cleopatra, and never with the backing of the fearsome Mamluk slave soldiers. Under her command, the Mamluks crushed the Crusaders at the Battle of Mansoura, capturing Louis himself. The French king spent his imprisonment writing psalms, while Shajar dictated terms of surrender from her gilded divan. But power in the Mamluk court was a knife's edge. When Aybak tried to sideline her by taking a second wife, Shajar didn't protest. She invited him to a bathhouse and had him strangled by eunuchs. The assassination backfired spectacularly. Aybak's furious first wife, backed by rival Mamluks, stormed the palace. What happened next became legend. Stripped of her jewels, Shajar was beaten to death with wooden cuffs, the very bathhouse clog she'd used to step over Aybak's body. The brutality wasn't just punishment, it was symbolism. A woman who'd risen from slave to sovereign would die like one. Her mausoleum, though, tells a different story. Nestled in Cairo's historic quarter, its dome is a symphony of stone, blending Ayyubid austerity with Mamluk grandeur. Inside, the mosaic tiles form geometric patterns so precise they seem to vibrate, a visual metaphor for her rule where order concealed chaos. Most striking is the cenotaph, inscribed not just with Quranic verses but with her full titulature, Al-Malika al-Ismailiyya, the queen of the Ismaili line. This wasn't just a tomb, it was a final act of defiance, staking her claim in a world that tried to erase her. Modern historians still grapple with Shajar's legacy. Was she a murderous schemer or a ruler who played the only cards dealt to her? The answer might lie in the accounts of Ibn Taghraberdi, a chronicler who noted that during her brief reign, Nile floods were perfect, granaries overflowed, and even the Crusaders whispered her name with reluctant respect. The wooden shoes that ended her life now sit in a museum, their leather straps still stained faintly red, a reminder that in the Game of Thrones even the pawns draw blood. When Rome marched into Britannia, they expected to conquer tribes led by brutish chieftains, not queens, who could outthink their generals. Boudicca's fiery revolt is etched into history, but she wasn't alone. Across the misty highlands and dense forests of ancient Britain, Celtic women like Cartimandua wielded power with a sophistication that left Roman historians scrambling to explain them away as either hysterical rebels or traitorous pawns. The truth, unearthed from the soil of hill forts and the ink of broken treaties, reveals a far more intriguing story, one where alliances were as sharp as swords and survival demanded more than battlefield glory. Take Cartimandua, ruler of the Brigantes, a kingdom so vast it spanned modern-day Yorkshire to Scotland. While Boudicca's name became synonymous with rebellion, Cartimandua's legacy is a masterclass in realpolitik. When the Roman legions arrived, she didn't raise an army, she extended a hand, securing her people's autonomy through diplomacy. Tacitus sneered at her as a shameful collaborator, but the archaeology tells a different tale. Excavations at her stronghold of Stanwick reveal luxurious Roman imports glassware, wine amphorae intermingled with traditional Celtic talks. This wasn't surrender, it was strategic symbiosis. By aligning with Rome, she shielded her lands from the devastation Boudicca's Iceni would soon suffer, but her boldest move came during the revolt of 49 AD, when she captured the rebel leader Caratacus and handed him to the Romans in chains. The act cemented her status as Rome's indispensable ally, even as Celtic bards branded her a betrayer. Yet to reduce these queens to loyalist or rebel is to miss the point entirely. Boudicca's uprising wasn't mindless rage, it was calculated retribution. After Roman soldiers flogged her and raped her daughters, she didn't just rally the Iceni. She united 5 previously warring tribes under a shared cause. Dio Cassius claimed she roused her troops by shrieking about freedom, but the tactics she employed, ambushing the 9th Legion at Camulogenum, burning Londinium to ash, speak of a leader who understood Roman weaknesses better than Rome itself. The torched layer of red clay beneath modern London isn't just destruction, it's a message carved into the earth. The real shock comes when we compare Roman accounts with physical evidence. While classical writers painted Celtic women as emotional wildcards, the artifacts show meticulous statecraft. Cartimandua's coinage bears her name alongside her husband's, then later alone proof of a ruler who phased out male consorts as her authority solidified. Boudicca's talk, discovered near Norwich, isn't just jewelry. Its twisted gold strands mirror the intricate alliances she forged. Even the bones tell a story. Mass graves from Boudicca's final battle show warriors of both sexes, their injuries identical, debunking the myth that Celtic women only fought when men fell. The irony, Rome's own records betray their unease. Tacitus admits Boudicca's forces slaughtered 70,000 Romans before their defeat, while Claudius's triumphal arch in Rome conspicuously omits any mention of British queens, a silent admission that acknowledging their power was too dangerous. Today, as archaeologists piece together burnt grain stores and diplomatic correspondence scratched onto lead tablets, a pattern emerges. These women weren't anomalies. They were part of a tradition where leadership wasn't gendered and sovereignty wore many faces. The Romans called them barbarians, but their real crime was proving that empire could be outmaneuvered by queens who knew the value of both the olive branch and the sword. While much of medieval Europe kept women locked away in convents or castles, the libraries of Cordoba burned bright with intellectual rebellion. And at the center stood Lubna, the caliph's personal scribe who built Europe's greatest treasury of knowledge from scratch. In the 10th century, when most women's names vanished from historical records, hers was etched into scholarly debates, administrative decrees, and even the margins of philosophy texts where she voraciously argued with male thinkers. Born into slavery but elevated by her razor-sharp mind, Lubna didn't just manage the royal library, she transformed it into a beacon of learning that drew scholars from Baghdad to Paris, all while composing poetry so cutting it silenced her critics. The scale of her achievements defies the era's constraints. As chief secretary to Caliph al-Hakam II, Lubna supervised the copying and translation of thousands of manuscripts, from Greek astronomy to Persian medicine, growing the palace library to over 400,000 volumes at a time when the largest Christian monastery held maybe 500. But she wasn't just a curator, she was a hunter of texts, dispatching agents to Constantinople and Damascus to track down rare works, then personally verifying their accuracy. One surviving account describes her tearing a faulty translation of Euclid's Elements in half before a stunned room of male mathematicians, declaring, "Truth isn't measured by the ink spilled, but by the minds illuminated." Her poetry, though few fragments remain, reveals a woman who wielded words like weapons. In a famous exchange with the vizier Ibn al-Arif, who quipped that ink stains on a woman belong in the laundry, not the court, Lubna fired back with verses mocking his rusty logic. "You measure wisdom by beards, not brains. Tell me, does a goat grow wise when its chin whitens?" The salon fell silent. Al-Arif later became one of her staunchest defenders. Even more radical were her commentaries on Aristotle, where she challenged his dismissal of female intellect, scribbling in one margin, "If nature abhors a vacuum, why do some minds resist filling?" The real mystery isn't how Lubna rose to power, it's why she vanished. After al-Hakam's death in 976, the new caliph's conservative viziers purged the court of innovators. Some chronicles claim Lubna fled to Medina, smuggling precious manuscripts under her robes. Others say she was quietly pensioned off, but her legacy pulsed through the scholars she'd trained, like the physician al-Ghafiqi, who credited her with preserving Galen's lost works. Today, while Cordoba's library lies in ruins, archaeologists still find shreds of parchment with her distinctive handwriting, a looping, impatient scrawl that seems to race ahead of the pen. In a world that tried to erase her, the ink refused to fade. The pyramids of Mara rise from the Nubian desert like jagged teeth, steep-sided, sharp-angled, and utterly unlike their Egyptian cousins. But the real difference isn't in their shape, it's in the names carved inside. Walk through their shadowed chambers and you'll find inscriptions proclaiming queens not just as royal consorts, but as full co-rulers bearing titles like Lord of the Two Lands and She Who Crushes Rebellion. This was a civilization where power wasn't just inherited through kings, but wielded by warrior matriarchs who led armies, negotiated treaties, and built temples so grand they made pharaohs blush. Take Amanirenas, whose gold-covered pyramid once gleamed like a second sun over the savannah. Roman accounts dismissed her as a barbarian queen, but the artifacts tell another story. A recently deciphered stela describes her personally leading cavalry charges against desert raiders, while her ironsmiths produced weapons so advanced, archaeologists initially thought they were medieval imports. Then there's Amanita, immortalized in reliefs at the Temple of Ammon with muscles rippling as she smites enemies alongside her husband, both depicted as equals in size and divine favor. Unlike Egyptian art, which shrank royal women beside towering pharaohs, Kushite carvings show queens standing shoulder to shoulder with kings, their shared authority carved in stone. But why did Kush embrace female rule when its neighbors resisted it? The answer lies in the goddess at the heart of their cosmology, Amesimi, the lioness-headed protector whose cult elevated women as earthly extensions of divine power. Where Egypt's state religion centered on male gods like Ammon, Kushite queens derived legitimacy directly from Amesimi's fierce maternal energy. Succession didn't skip daughters if a king died without sons. It flowed through the female line like the Nile's annual floods, unpredictable but life-giving. Even more radical was the Kandake system, not just a title meaning queen mother, but a political office. Kandakes didn't merely advise kings, they held veto power over military campaigns and could depose weak rulers. A Greek merchant's account, preserved on crumbling papyrus, recounts witnessing a Kandake publicly strip a cowardly king of his regalia, declaring, "You tremble like a gazelle, this throne eats lions." The proof of their influence isn't just in grand monuments. At the ruins of Naka, archaeologists uncovered a throne room with two identical seats, one slightly taller, inscribed for the king, the other wider, designed for the elaborate skirts of his co-ruling queen. Nearby, a stash of tax records on clay tablets shows queens personally authorizing trade deals, their seals stamped beside their husbands. Even their jewelry carried political weight. While Egyptian queens wore delicate pectorals symbolizing fertility, Kushite queens donned heavy gold cuff bracelets engraved with battle scenes, a wearable resume of military prowess. The greatest testament to their legacy, Rome's baffled response. When Augustus boasted of conquering Kush after Amanirenas' revolt, he conspicuously avoided occupying Mara itself. The same queen who'd lost an eye in battle still ruled, and her daughter Amanita was already training her own heir. For all its might, Rome seemed to grasp what later historians missed. Some walls couldn't be toppled because they were held up by the hands of women who knew their worth wasn't in their beauty, but in their ability to strike as hard as the desert sun. Drahomira of Bohemia didn't just resist Christianity, she waged a cultural war so fierce, her name became synonymous with pagan defiance. In the 10th century, as German missionaries pressed eastward, converting Slavic tribes at sword point, this regent mother stood as the last bulwark of the old ways. But history remembers her not as a protector, but as a murderer. The villainess who strangled her own mother-in-law, Saint Ludmilla, with her veil. The truth, as always, lies tangled between German hymns and Slavic folktales, between the quills of monks and the whispers of grandmothers at twilight. Look at the Christian chronicles, and Drahomira is pure nightmare. The life of Saint Ludmilla, penned by Teutonic scribes, describes her as a viper in silk, ordering Ludmilla's assassination to stop her from converting young Prince Wenceslaus to Christianity. They paint her reign as a Dark Age pagan, priests performing blood rites in Prague Castle, Christian converts disappearing into bogs, but unearth the older Slavic texts like the Chronicle of Cosmas, and a different portrait emerges. Here, Drahomira is the defender of Czech sovereignty against German political takeover, her resistance framed not as heathen stubbornness, but as a mother's fight to keep her sons from becoming puppets of the Holy Roman Empire. The murder itself is shrouded in theater. Christian sources claim Ludmilla was praying when assassins crept in, offering her the martyr's choice of sword or veil. She chose the veil to spare her killers the sin of bloodshed. Slavic oral traditions counter that Ludmilla died in a skirmish between rival noble factions, her sainthood concocted later to justify German influence. Archaeology adds fuel to the debate. Ludmilla's skull, venerated as a relic in Prague, shows no signs of strangulation, only a massive fracture consistent with a fall or blunt weapon. Drahomira's real crime may have been timing. When her husband, Duke Vratislaus, died young, she ruled as regent for Wenceslaus, a boy already being groomed by Ludmila's Christian faction. Her resistance wasn't just religious, it was political. She minted coins with pagan symbols, fortified borderlands against German incursions, and allied with the Palabian Slavs who still worshipped Perun and Veles. German bishops, furious at her blocking their access to Wenceslaus, needed a demon to explain their failure. A murdering pagan queen fit perfectly. The fallout reveals the stakes. When Wenceslaus came of age and embraced Christianity, Drahomira didn't fade quietly. Chronicles claim she conspired with her younger son, Boleslav, to overthrow him, though some Slavic ballads insist she was framed. Wenceslaus's murder later earning him sainthood, and Boleslav's subsequent reign complicate the narrative further. Boleslav, though Christian, continued his mother's anti-German policies, suggesting her fight was always more about autonomy than idols. Today, the Czech Republic still wrestles with her legacy. In the stained glass of St. Vitus Cathedral, Ludmila gleams beatifically while Drahomira lurks in shadows. But visit rural Moravia during the summer solstice, and you might hear old women leaving honeyed cakes at crossroads and offering not to saints, but to the dark lady who refused to kneel. The land remembers what the books tried to erase. Power isn't just about who writes the hymns, but who keeps singing the old songs when no one's listening. At the height of Cahokia's power, the Mississippi River Valley thrummed with the footsteps of thousands, a sprawling city of earthen pyramids, bustling markets, and ritual plazas that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. Then, around 1300 AD, it all vanished, but in the silent layers of soil beneath modern-day Illinois, archaeologists keep unearthing whispers of a woman who may have ruled this civilization in its twilight. Buried deep in Mound 72, surrounded by sacrificial retainers and warriors, lies a skeleton draped in 20,000 shell beads. A corpse so lavishly honored, researchers now believe she wasn't just a noble, but perhaps the last great leader of a dying empire. The evidence is fragmented but tantalizing. Cahokia left no written records, but the arrangement of goods in this royal tomb speaks volumes. The woman's body rests on a bed of arrowheads, her head cradled by a copper falcon effigy, the same bird god depicted on ceremonial tablets found in temple precincts. Nearby, 53 young women were buried in neat rows, their bones showing no signs of violence, suggesting voluntary death rites, most revealing. The absence of male regalia, while chiefly burials from earlier periods feature stone maces and warrior symbolism, this grave holds weaving tools, carved fertility figures, and a cache of seeds. Taken together, these artifacts paint a portrait of a ruler whose authority flowed not from the battlefield, but from control of food systems, textile production, and spiritual ceremonies. Climate data adds urgency to her story. Tree rings from the period reveal catastrophic droughts beginning around 1250 AD, precisely when Cahokia's Grand Plaza began emptying. Some theorists suggest this queen presided over a desperate pivot, attempting to stabilize society through ritual and redistribution. The sheer scale of her burial mound, constructed during famine, implies she commanded staggering labor forces even as crops failed. Copper samples traced to Lake Superior hint at trade networks she may have leveraged to import food, while the remains of feasts in outlying villages show corn suddenly replaced by hardy, drought-resistant goosefoot, a dietary shift that could only have been enforced from the top. The mystery deepens with the Birdman tablets. These engraved stone slabs found near her mound show a figure with falcon wings merging with a woman in a patterned skirt. Early archaeologists assumed the Birdman was male, but forensic analysis of the skirt's design matches weaving techniques unique to elite Cahokian women. Could this be her, depicted as a hybrid deity? The timing fits. Similar iconography appears in rock art along the Arkansas River just as Cahokia's influence waned, suggesting her cult spread with refugees. Then there's the collapse itself. Unlike the violent ends of many civilizations, Cahokia's dissolution seems eerily intentional. Houses were ritually burned in neat sequences, temple doors ceremonially sealed. No mass graves, no evidence of invasion, just quiet abandonment. Some scholars argue this queen's final act was an ordered retreat, directing her people to disperse before resources vanished entirely. Oral traditions from the Osage and Quapaw peoples tell of a blue-robed woman who led their ancestors eastward carrying sacred bundles. Could this be her legacy, not ruin but reinvention? The truth may lie in the dirt yet unexcavated. Ground-penetrating radar recently revealed a hidden chamber beneath Mound 72, its contents still untouched. Whatever waits there, more copper regalia, written clues on perishable bark, or simply silence, it holds the story of a ruler who stood at the precipice, guiding her people into the unknown. Cahokia's mounds still loom against the Midwestern sky, but its last queen's voice lingers too, etched not in words but in the careful placement of seeds, shells, and the bones of those who chose to follow her even into the dark. These 25 rulers share more than just crowns. They share the eerie echo of erasure. Whether chiseled from monuments like Hatshepsut, demonized like Zetian, or reduced to footnotes like Sobekneferu, their stories were systematically pruned from history's tree. But look closer and patterns emerge. Erasure wasn't random, it followed a script. Queens who succeeded as diplomats like Pujuhepa were recast as exceptional anomalies. Those who ruled militarily like Amanirenas were labeled barbarians, and those who reshaped cultures like Lubna of Cordoba were buried under layers of anonymous scholarship. Each silencing served the same purpose: to make female power seem unnatural, impossible, or worse, forgettable. Yet archaeology keeps pulling these women back into the light. A tooth in a box restored Hatshepsut's mummy. A scrap of Moroitic graffiti proved Amanirenas' treaty. A child's rhyme in Vietnam preserved the Trung sisters' battle cry. These aren't lucky accidents, they're proof that suppression never fully works. History has a way of bleeding through the cracks, especially when the marginalized fight to remember. The Kandaks of Kush didn't just build pyramids, they encoded their legacy in stone, knowing future generations would decode it. Theodora's laws outlived the smears about her past because justice, once granted, is harder to revoke than reputation. So why does this matter now? Because every time we rediscover a queen like Razia Sultan or Judith, we're handed a lens to examine our own blind spots. Who else is missing from your textbooks, whose statues aren't in your town square? Start digging, and you'll find them women who led rebellions, brokered peace, or built libraries in places history claims they never belonged. Your local archives might hold letters from a forgotten mayor, diaries of a tribal matriarch, or songs about a farmer's wife who outsmarted invaders. These stories aren't lost, they're waiting. Hit subscribe because this series isn't ending here. Next week, we're unearthing warrior women from the Viking sagas to the Amazonian jungles, and trust me, you've never heard their real names before. Until then, pick up a history book and ask who's not in the index. The past is a mosaic, and we're still finding the missing